Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this week's webcast. My name is Aaron Robertson, Communications Manager for Oregon Wild. A quick outline of our hour-long program today. Jimmy Tobias is our presenter. Unfortunately, despite our best efforts, we weren't able to get his webcam working with GoToWebinar, so he will be a disembodied voice today. After Jimmy, we'll hear from Doug Heiken, Oregon Wild's Conservation and Restoration Coordinator. And following that, there will be time for Q&A. You can enter your questions at any time using the webcast interface, and those questions will go to me, and I'll ask them at the end of the presentation as we have time. If suddenly your screen freezes or you lose the presenter slide deck, try closing completely out of the program and then rejoining using the event link that was emailed to you about an hour ago. If you're on mobile, you should be able to control which view you're seeing and how big it is by tapping on your screen. A video of this webcast will be emailed out tomorrow and will be posted on our website, OregonWild.org, in the Wild blog section. And if you got a raffle ticket, thank you. Your support allows us to continue doing these presentations. The winners will be contacted by email tomorrow. Next week will be an extension of this conversation, Trump's environmental rollbacks, but we're going to do some very specific Oregon proposals, including the attack on the 21-inch screens that you may have seen an alert that we sent out on today. And that proposal, as it turns out, is even worse than we feared, and basically eliminates all protections for old growth in Eastern Oregon. The Oregon Wild team will be talking about that and other attacks, as well as how you can take action to fight back. A sign up for that presentation will be included in the follow-up email to this presentation and can also be found online right now at OregonWild.org. And now that I'm done talking to you, I'm excited to present Jimmy Tobias. Jimmy does investigative reporting for The Guardian and The Nation, writing about conservation, civil society, and cities. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Pacific Standard, High Country News, and many other outlets. And today he'll be talking about Donald Trump's Department of the Interior, its most corrupt appointees, and egregious environmental rollbacks. And I'm going to turn things over now to Jimmy.
All right, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you. Even though you can't see me, I'm smiling. And yeah, I'm here to talk about the Department of the Interior. I'm sure you're all very familiar with it, but I always feel like it doesn't quite get the attention it deserves. I mean, this is a huge, powerful agency with a vast array of responsibilities. It manages a fifth of the country's landmass. It oversees offshore drilling. It enforces the Endangered Species Act. It operates the national parks and the wildlife refuge system. And it runs perhaps our country's premier scientific agency, the U.S. Geological Survey. It basically touches every American's life in a significant way. Next up here. Yeah, and yet under this president, the department has been turned into something of a plaything for big industry and right-wing activists. From the earliest days of the administration, the department has coordinated very closely with big oil, the coal industry, agricultural interests, and right-wing ideological groups of all kinds, many of which were former clients or employers of the very people that Trump appointed to lead the agency. The revolving door at the department, the conflicts of interest of its top employees, their coziness with powerful economic concerns have led directly to policy decisions that harm public lands and wildlife. And today, I specifically want to talk about how corruption and conflicts of interest at the department have undermined protections for endangered and threatened species. Because, as many of you probably know, we are in the midst of an extinction crisis. The scientists tell us that up to 1 million species are threatened with extinction in the coming decades, and that has all sorts of very dire implications for human beings and their civilization and their society. But to begin with, I want to start by talking about some of the key leaders at the department, powerful people with all sorts of interesting conflicts. Let's see here. The first person, who you're probably also familiar with, is David Bernhardt. He is the current Secretary of the Interior. He's had a long tenure at the agency. When Ryan Zinke was the secretary, he was the deputy secretary, and many people felt that he was kind of running the show the whole time. This guy is a longtime mega lobbyist for Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, and Schreck, a big name firm that represents oil groups, major agricultural irrigators like the Westlands Water District, mining companies like Hudbay. He's also been on the board of the anti-endangered species group, CSER, in California. He's been a longtime opponent of the Endangered Species Act, working in the courts and in the public sphere to roll back protections. And since taking power, many of the people he once represented as a lobbyist have benefited mightily from his tenure. And I'll get into details on that a little bit later in the presentation. But Bernhardt is not the only ethically challenged person at DOI. He's got a number of friends, including Katharine MacGregor, who is now the Deputy Interior Secretary, a former Republican staffer. She is a close ally of energy interests. There was an article, I think it was last year, where oil exec was kind of caught on tape telling people that when they have a permitting issue, we just call Kate. She also, and this is from a story that I worked on, she early in her tenure in 2017, she had like 6 meetings in a row with big coal companies, and like less than a month later, she played a key role in canceling a prominent ongoing study of the health impacts of mountaintop removal coal mining in Appalachia. A highly controversial decision, obviously. So that's kind of where she's coming from. Then you got Doug Domenech. He actually is Secretary Bernhardt's best friend. Bernhardt recommended him for the job, and he has just been mired in corruption scandals his entire time at DOI. He's kind of my favorite appointee. He also happens to be the father-in-law of Meghan McCain, and her husband is his son, Ben Domenech, a right-wing political writer who's kind of well-known. But yeah, in the last 8 months alone, Doug Domenech has been the subject of 2 scathing investigations by the agency's Inspector General for using his office to provide favors to former employers and his family members. 2 years ago, an article I wrote about him, he basically 2 years ago in 2017, right at the beginning of his time at DOI, he invited his former employer to come to the agency and meet a bunch of top appointees. They had this big get together where they talked about a couple legal cases, one of which was to roll back endangered species protections for a spider in Texas. And that meeting led to an ethics complaint, and then the Inspector General investigated him, and they found that he violated federal ethics rules. And this is a person who has had a long association with the Interior Department. He worked there under Bush, so he should have known what he was doing, but he used his office to give access to his former employers, all these Koch brother-backed groups that had an agenda at the department. And so he really, in some ways, I view him as one of the key figures at the agency, because he sort of set the tone. He invited all these Koch brother groups in at the beginning. They got to share their ideas when everyone else was left out in the cold. And you can kind of see the results of that kind of conflict of interest taking hold so early in the administration. Many people, I should add, numerous senators and congressmen have called for him to be fired, but so far he's still at the agency, and many people speculate that he's still there because he is David Bernhardt's best friend. They're close personal friends. Next up is Daniel Giorgiani. He's the top lawyer at the department. He came to the agency from a job working for one of the Koch brothers' largest think tanks, basically. And since taking office, he's been at the forefront of numerous controversial decisions, including the administration's attempted gutting of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, as well as its systematic attack on the Freedom of Information Act and government transparency. He's also been accused of perjury for testimony he gave in front of the Senate, during which he allegedly, he kind of misled the senators about his involvement in undermining FOIA. And if you've ever watched him in a congressional hearing, he's a very skilled dissembler. He's very skilled at dodging questions. He's a bit of a shifty character. Then there's Aurelia Skipwith. She is the current director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. She's a former employee at Monsanto and also has ties to a lobbying firm that worked for big agriculture irrigation districts. And yeah, she's running the show. She's the top person in charge of enforcing the Endangered Species Act right now. Then we've got William Perry Pendley. You've probably heard of him. He's been in the news a lot lately. He's basically the acting director of the Bureau of Land Management. This is a guy who has spent his life fighting public lands protections, fighting the Endangered Species Act. I got a hold of a tape, and I wrote this article about him, where he joked about killing endangered species. He told his audience that, that joke, out west we say shoot, shovel, and shut up, and he got a bunch of laughs. And he has mocked Native American religion. He, has filed all sorts of lawsuits to roll back protections when he worked for the Mountain States Legal Foundation, which is a anti-public land law firm funded by big oil and right-wing foundations. And he's the guy who has been leading the agency's charge to move BLM headquarters to Grand Junction, Colorado, a move that has shattered morale at the agency and forced out lots of good people. And then Karen Bud Fallon, she's pretty well known out west. She's a longtime attorney for ranching interests. She's been called a lifelong sagebrush rebel. She is an outspoken foe of the Endangered Species Act. And right now, she got a job working as an attorney in the solicitor's office, where she focuses on wildlife law and wildlife protections. So you can see who's running the show. These are the top people at the agency, many of them. And I guess the question is, what has this led to? These are the people that I've described some of their conflicts of interest, but what has this corruption led to? What have these rampant conflicts resulted in? What has all this unethical, shady dealing done to the Interior Department? I want to take a brief look specifically at what it's done to the Endangered Species Act, because to me, the Endangered Species Act is probably our most powerful environmental law. And it is under sustained attack, as is the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the chief enforcement agency of the Endangered Species Act. So I'm going to just give a rundown now of how these conflicts of interest, these sort of corrupt links, these people who are running the show are influencing agency policy. Here's some of their track record. All right, about a year ago, as you may know, the Interior Department finalized a set of sweeping rollbacks to endangered species regulations that have seriously weakened the department's ability to tackle the extinction crisis, this growing, scary crisis that scientists tell us is getting worse. One of the things they did is roll back something called the blanket 4D rule. It was a regulation that gave strong blanket protections to species listed as threatened. And now those species no longer have those protections. They're kind of out on their own until the agency decides exactly what protections they get. So that probably was the most significant rollback. It was a big blow to threatened species protection. They have also hamstrung the Fish and Wildlife Service's ability to consider climate change when evaluating a given project under the Endangered Species Act. The agency basically is not allowed to really project far into the future to see how, say, rising sea levels are going to impact species that live in Key West or in other low-lying places. And so the agency really has no ability right now to actually address the impacts of climate change on endangered species. It's very limited. They have also significantly limited the agency's ability to designate critical habitat designation for species who maybe have been driven into a small portion of their home range, and there's a potentially decent spot that could be rehabilitated where they could be reintroduced or something. Now the agency isn't allowed to protect places like that. So the critical habitat designation, that's a new decision that many think was kind of led by Karen Bud Fallon, but But all of these three things together mean that fewer species are getting protected, and the protections they do get are going to be much weaker than they otherwise would have been. And in doing things like this, the agency has really followed the lead of prominent right-wing anti-endangered species groups. Those include people like the Pacific Legal Foundation, which is maybe the country's most prominent anti-ESA legal group, a group funded by all sorts of right-wing foundations, as well as the National Endangered Species Act Reform Coalition, which is a coalition of oil groups, mining groups, big agriculture groups that are fighting quietly but persistently to roll back ESA protections. And when you look at these appointees and who they've met with over the years, you see names like Pacific Legal Foundation show up. You see names like NESARC show up. In fact, Pacific Legal Foundation, I got emails from FOIA that showed them directly reaching out to Daniel Giorgiani, the top lawyer at the agency, and they were specifically advocates of rolling back the 4D rule that I mentioned before. And there's more. The agency has made it a priority to delist species. It has been a priority of David Bernhardt and his attorneys, and it has trickled down to the Fish and Wildlife Service. In the southeastern region, for instance, it's like one of the top goals for the region to hit a certain number of delistings every year. So they've really prioritized removing species from protection, and of course they find all sorts of reasons to do so, and some of them are legitimate, but many are much more controversial, and this has become sort of like they're just constantly trying to delist. They've also, as I mentioned before, Daniel Giorgiani really spearheaded this effort to, I would say it's fair to say, kind of gut the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. They issued a legal memo in the early days of the administration to prevent the agency from prosecuting companies that accidentally kill birds. So say you build a giant energy project and a bunch of birds die, just because you weren't intending to kill them doesn't mean you didn't kill them. But unless you actually had intent to kill them, now under the DOI's rules, you can't be prosecuted. And that rollback is being challenged in court. And actually, there was a pretty significant victory recently over it by conservation groups. But this is all part of the same trend. You also probably are aware of the gutting of the Obama-era sage-grouse plans across the West. That was a top priority for these folks from the second they got in here, and obviously it was a top priority for the oil and gas industry, who's had unfettered access to the administration from the beginning. One of the most powerful components of the Endangered Species Act is Section 7 consultations, when a federal agency that's undertaking a project has to go to the Fish and Wildlife Service and get its blessing before moving forward. Nowadays, those consultations are basically rubber stamps. The Fish and Wildlife Service almost never, and this is to be fair to the administration, I mean, this is a long time problem. This has happened under Democratic administrations and Republican administrations. But nowadays, when an agency goes to the Fish and Wildlife Service and asks for a consultation, they almost never ever call jeopardy on the project, which is basically the Fish and Wildlife Service's word for saying the project can't happen. And then, they're abandoning predator reintroduction in all sorts of different places, notably in the North Cascades, where, there was Ryan Zinke had supported reintroducing grizzlies, and David Bernhardt has since rolled that back. And I've been working, the reason I'm focused on the Fish and Wildlife Service so much is I've been working on a kind of a big investigative story about the agency and its current state. And I've talked to lots and lots of recent retirees from the agency, and they describe just rock bottom morale. I've had more than one person kind of break down into tears on the phone with me over what they went through at the agency. And so it's very distressing that this agency that's responsible for upholding our most important environmental law, at least what I consider our most important environmental law, is just kind of in shambles. A couple specific case studies that I want to touch on. This was a story I wrote in 2018. I got a hold of like a leaked memo from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and a huge theme at this department under the during the Trump era has been to crack down as much as possible on government transparency. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service issued a memo across the agency, basically telling its staff to release less under FOIA, to limit the ability of people to get decisions, emails, other things through the Freedom of Information Act. And this is going to have a real impact as long as this administration is in power, because many environmental groups rely on FOIA to get documents that they use in court cases when they challenge Fish and Wildlife Service decisions. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is often making decisions that are worthy of being challenged. I mean, they're an agency that is not up to the task right now of enforcing this law. And so the fact that they've cracked down on FOIA is a very bad sign, and will definitely, I think, hamstring the public's ability to hold this agency accountable. And then this is a very clear case study that I think perfectly illustrates the priorities of the department. In California, there's a giant irrigation project called the Central Valley Project that was built by the Bureau of Reclamation, and it provides water to all sorts of huge agricultural operations in the Central Valley. And the feds want to allow this project to drain a lot more water out of California's rivers and streams to provide cheap water to these big agricultural interests. And one of the groups that stands to benefit most, probably the most, is the Westlands Water District. And the Westlands Water District is one of David Bernhardt's, the Interior Secretary's most prominent former clients. He worked for them for years, represented them in court, and up to the day that he joined the Trump administration's landing team at Interior, he was working for these folks. But in order to move forward with this proposed plan to suck more water out of California's rivers, the Interior Department's Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as NOAA, had to evaluate the impact of this proposal on endangered species in California and determine if this proposed water grab was going to hurt endangered species. And so a bunch of federal scientists with the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA got together last year to evaluate the issue, and they found that the proposal would jeopardize the continued existence of orcas, salmon, and other imperiled species. But before these scientists could issue their decision, before this decision ever made it to the public, the Interior Department intervened. It removed the scientists who had been working on the project and shelved their report. A couple months later, a new report was issued, and it found that the water diversions would in fact not harm these imperiled species. And you know, that's the kind of activities that are going on all over the place with this administration. I mean, this is a water district that David Bernhardt represented and has been working hard to kind of aggrandize, and his department intervened in this scientific evaluation to get what it wanted. And so I think that kind of tells the story. That kind of tells the story of what's happening here. And it's happening all over the place. And I'm sure it's happening in your neck of the woods too. So yeah, that is basically the rundown. Those are the people in charge, and this is the kind of thing they're doing. And as I said, I'm working on a project to get deeper into the story, to try to figure out a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of what's going on here. But you know, there's a lot of evidence already in plain sight. So yeah, I really appreciate you being here tonight. I'm excited to take your questions, and it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, Jimmy. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Doug, who's going to give a little presentation. And unmute himself. Great.
Hi there. Is the screen sharing working yet?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not seeing it on my end.
We
Let's
can see your first slide.
Oh, you can?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, well, hopefully this will work. Well, thanks everyone for taking time out of your evening to spend a little time with us. And thank you, Jimmy. That was quite an informative presentation. I'd never even heard of many of these people deep into the Interior Department, and I'm so glad there are people like you out there digging into those details. There's reminds me of how much work there's going to be to undo all of this stuff if Trump loses the election. I'm Doug Heiken. I work in the Eugene office of Oregon Wild. I'm kind of the timber sale guy. I review all the documents that the Forest Service and BLM puts out about timber sales and try to get them to do a better job. And tonight I'm going to review the spotted owl situation, kind of give you the your periodic refresher on the northern spotted owl, but I'll be weaving in some of the latest information. And you can think of this as kind of a deep dive in one of the rollbacks that is going on under the Trump administration. So the spotted owl, I can't tell what you guys are seeing. I'm only seeing my end.
We're still seeing the first slide.
Oh, really?
We can see your cursor.
I wish I could minimize this. I'm sorry about this technical glitch. It's not working like it was when we did the run through. I can only, well, shoot. I'll just do my best here and maybe we'll figure it out as we go along. The spotted owl is an old forest obligate. It was chosen as an indicator species by the U.S. Forest Service to indicate the health of old forests. And because they were logging so much old growth, we were finding out that this indicator was telling us the old growth was not healthy. The spotted owl is listed as a threatened species primarily because of old growth clear cutting and the fragmentation of its habitat. The Forest Service and BLM established large reserves on public lands, and Fish and Wildlife established critical habitat units that were supposed to protect large blocks of habitat, suitable habitat, where 20+ pairs of spotted owls could breed and interact, and then occasionally disperse from one large reserve to another. So why do these old forests matter? Well, one is that the canopy cover itself is like a roof on your house. It's protection from predators and protection from climate extremes. They're, you know, on a hot day or a cold winter day, an old growth forest is a nice place that moderates those extremes. There's also vegetation diversity provides food security for the spotted owls. All the different plants produce different kinds of food for different kinds of small animals that provide prey for the spotted owl. So you've got fruit and nuts and tree seeds and nectar and fungi, and all these food sources supply food for different prey animals. So if one population happens to be down, the others are still available. So the spotted owl is not too reliant on one particular food supply. It's useful to think of old growth or as forest habitat as a three-dimensional space. It's not just lines on a map, but actually a three-dimensional space. So a tree farm or a young forest is really just a shallow puddle of habitat, whereas a tall old growth forest with all its different layers is more of like a deep ocean of habitat. The main reason the spotted owl is threatened is somewhat obvious. There was decades of clear cutting of our ancient forests, which left the system quite fragmented. And it's not just one clear cut and one road isn't the problem. It's decades of clear cutting and too many clear cuts and too many roads. So this is a view of the McKenzie watershed east of Eugene that really shows how fragmented everything is. Spotted owls would much prefer large blocks of habitat, but here they barely find a refuge in these tiny fragments.
Hey,
So
Doug,
the main
we're not
topic
actually
today,
seeing that slide. We're still seeing your opening slide.
oh shoot. Okay, that's good to know. How do we fix this?
You have one on one screen and one on the other.
I could drag this over like this.
Yeah, now we can see that.
But then when I click this, okay, here we go. Here's
there we go. Old growth matter.
There's your old growth. I'm glad we got that straight. There's the contrast between young forest and old forest. There's why spotted owls are endangered. Now we're catching up to where we were. Here's the cumulative effects of all that clear cutting. And now we're diving into the main topic of today's presentation, which is the Trump administration is gutting the protection of spotted owls, in particular their critical habitat. And they're not doing this in Washington. They're not doing it in California. They're doing it just in Oregon. Aren't we lucky? This is based on a sweetheart deal. It's a legal settlement with the timber industry where the lawsuit was filed in 2013 and they came up with a settlement in 2020. And the gist of it is they are undesignating approximately 185,000 acres of existing critical habitat in the Bureau of Land Management's harvest land base in Western Oregon, plus another 20,000 acres on lands that were BLM lands and are recently transferred to some tribes. Now, the 2016 resource management plans adopted by BLM designated most of this critical habitat as a low intensity harvest area. It's still going to be harvested, but they're going to do it a little bit less intensely. And now without critical habitat, we're afraid they could go in and amend those plans to make the logging more aggressive. And the justification for this whole proposal is economics. You know, they think that money from timber sales is more important than the spotted owls, but they're not considering other economic impacts, such as the loss of ecosystem services or the social cost of carbon dioxide emissions, which vastly exceed the value of the timber. Here is a map of the proposal. The black is the BLM lands that are being excluded from critical habitat. These are areas that BLM was going to log or wants to log, and now it will not have the protection of critical habitat. Here we're zooming in on southwest Oregon, Jackson County. It's one of the most hard-hit areas. It's also an area that they really want to log, and an area where the spotted owl is declining rapidly. So it's an area where we're very concerned. And here is the tribal parcels. There's a dark blue area in the north that is the Confederated Tribes of the Coos Lower Umpqua Siuslaw. You see my cursor there, I hope. And then here's some in red, these Cow Creek tribe of the Umpqua, the Cow Creek band of the Umpqua tribe, which has some lands being excluded. And these were lands that were BLM lands recently, but they were recently transferred to the tribes. There are several reasons this is a problem. The three main reasons I'm going to put a little extra time into. One is that our old growth reserves are not yet functioning as we intended them to. Another reason is that the barred owl is competing with the spotted owl, and it increases the chances of extinction. And the third reason is that BLM lands provide a critical role in the recovery of the spotted owl. BLM lands provide connectivity between the Klamath Mountains, the Coast Range, and the Cascades. So this map shows what a large reserve is in the Fall Creek area. This is the areas that are set aside and protected for spotted owls. And if they would have been established 50 or 60 years ago, this would be a sea of old growth. But in this picture, you can see that the light colored green is old clear cuts and the dark green is actually old growth. And so they didn't establish this in time to really protect it from logging. It was heavily logged before the Northwest Forest Plan came along. And so our reserves are not functioning as large blocks of habitat. They're functioning as highly fragmented habitat. So loss of critical habitat is not a good time to do that. We're only 25 years into the 200-year process of restoring these reserves to their intended levels. Now, the barred owl is another very serious issue. When the Northwest Forest Plan was adopted, the barred owl was somewhat recognized, but they didn't realize how bad it was going to get. They assumed that all of the available suitable spotted owl habitat would be available to spotted owls, but instead it is occupied by barred owls, occupied and defended by barred owls, and barred owls are very good at defending this habitat. So this basic assumption of the Northwest Forest Plan doesn't hold. The barred owl invaded from eastern North America, and now basically occupies the entire range of the spotted owl. In many places, there's more barred owls than spotted owls. But interestingly, where there is more and better habitat, the spotted owl can coexist. And where there is less habitat or degraded habitat, it increases the chance of adverse competitive interactions between the two species. There are plans to control the barred owl population, but it's controversial and it will never fully work. The barred owls will always be here. The barred owl is a new threat to the spotted owl, but it makes conservation of habitat even more important. Here's a map showing the original range of the barred owl in eastern North America, and then how it is extended over to the northwest, and now it overlaps here with the range of the spotted owl. Here's a zoomed in parcel of BLM lands where there is more barred owls than spotted owls. The blue triangles are barred owls, the red dots are spotted owls, which is pretty sad. And here's a little graphic showing that when the Northwest Forest Plan was approved in 1994, spotted owls were barred owls were just a small problem, and now in 2020, barred owls have invaded everything. It's a very large problem, and they haven't really adjusted plans to deal with that. This is a really important graphic. It basically shows that the more old growth there is in a spotted owl's home range, the better able the spotted owl is to compete with the barred owl. Where there's just a little bit of habitat, like 10% old forest in the home range, then the barred owl does better. But where there's a lot of old forest in the home range, then the spotted owl and barred owl can compete equally for that habitat. This is important. And the third main reason that this is a really bad idea to cut back on critical habitat is that these BLM lands play a really important role in the overall conservation scheme for the spotted owl recovery. BLM lands are like a connectivity corridor or a linkage system that links up the Coast Range and the Cascades and the Klamath Mountains. This map shows in dark green the large reserves, primarily in the Cascades, Coast Range, Klamath Mountains, and then spotted owls need to be able to occasionally disperse in between these large mountain range areas, and that's where these BLM checkerboard lands come into play. So removing critical habitat or removing protection for those lands will have very unfortunate consequences for the spotted owl. There's been, many scientific reports about this. For instance, reduced long-term distribution of spotted owls linking the Oregon Coast Range, Klamath Mountains, and Oregon Cascades is highly likely to reduce the chances of spotted owls moving among these provinces. The distribution on national forests alone will not meet the requirements for spotted owl recovery. Another quote here says that the O&C lands, the Oregon and California Railroad lands that BLM manages, are more crucial to spotted owl conservation than many other lands, especially in Oregon. So another big issue is wildfire. A lot of people are very concerned about that. But it's important to keep this in perspective. Fire is a natural process, and spotted owls evolved with fire. So it really shouldn't be that big of a problem. Owls still live in burned forests if they're not salvage logged. And old forests are currently being recruited after being burned faster than they're being lost to fire. So new old forests are coming online faster than old forests are being lost to fire. So that's good news. However, the spotted owl is kind of living on the edge. So any small loss of old forest could be very harmful to the survival of the species. And there used to be lots of replacement habitat. When one patch burned, there's many other patches that provided redundancy in the system. And now we've kind of lost redundancy, so we've lost resilience. And climate change adds a twist that is difficult to deal with. Now, some people say that we should log these forests to protect them from fire. But really, logging is a much bigger threat to spotted owls than fire is. Owls, again, they evolved with fire, so fire is not necessarily a problem for the owl. And there's a low probability that our fuel treatments will actually interact with fire. And there's a high probability that logging is going to degrade their habitat. So, and fuel treatments only have a modest effect on fire behavior. So if you're a spotted owl, you'd probably rather take your chances with fire than to deal with the very certain harms from logging. Climate change also has a new and unknown effects on forests. Climate change may alter the way forests grow after disturbance. It may alter fire and other disturbances themselves. And that's what created the old growths that we know and love. How succession and forest growth interacted with fires and other disturbances. That's how every old growth forest that you know and love actually was created through those processes, and climate change is going to alter those processes. Climate change may make it harder to hold on to old growth forests, and it may make it harder to restore old growth from degraded conditions. It may lead to novel pathways after a fire burns. We don't know exactly how things are going to unfold. And owls are also stressed out by the extremes of heat and cold that can come along with climate change. Also, the Endangered Species Act is not working like it should. This is somewhat what Jimmy was talking about. The agencies are treating critical habitat badly. They should be treating critical habitat to really work toward recovery of the species, a very high bar, but instead they're trying to just barely avoid jeopardy, just keep the owl just an inch above extinction rather than restore them to a fully recovered position. And the agencies are self-consulting. Instead of talking to the Fish and Wildlife Service about what's best for the owl, they're just consulting with themselves, and they have a serious conflict of interest, obviously. One example is on the Umpqua National Forest. They redefined what suitable habitat is so they could log thousands of acres that happen to be close to roads. And let's not forget that there are many co-benefits from protecting owl habitat. Those old growth forests that we know and love, that's where our drinking water comes from. That's where we get flood control and summer stream flow. That's where we are building soil and stabilizing slopes, recreation, hunting and fishing, habitat for other at-risk species like the marbled murrelet and the fisher. So there's a lot of reasons. Climate change and carbon storage is another huge one. And we all get a lot of quality of life from these old growth forests. So I hope that wasn't too bumpy of a road for you. And thanks a lot for listening.
Thanks, Doug. And now Jimmy and I are going to come back online. Well, Jimmy's going to be a disembodied voice. And if you have questions, go ahead and enter them in the questions panel. I'm going to give us a little holding screen. Oh, there we go. And the first one is for you, Jimmy. Someone asking, under a Biden administration, of some of the rollbacks that you talked about, which ones can be rescinded, and do you have an idea of how long that might take to roll those back?
Yeah, I think, I mean, many of them are possible to rescind. Obviously, the damage that is done to the species that are impacted can't be reversed. The habitat that got developed can't be undeveloped. But things like the 4D rule rollback, that could go through the rulemaking process, and they could publish that regulation after getting public comment and going through legal review. And that kind of activity takes a while. It can take a year or more. But it'll certainly be possible to roll back a lot of these regulatory changes. But for instance, in the California case study I mentioned, once they start sending that water down to the big agriculture irrigators, that's going to be years of that, and in a state that's facing drought and all sorts of things. So the damage to species like salmon could be very real, even if these rules are eventually rolled back. But yes, I think though that the Biden administration is going to have to do a lot more than just repair the damage. They're going to have to really revitalize these agencies because they're in a very bad way.
Doug, what caused the barred owl to migrate from where it typically was over to the Pacific Northwest?
That is there is no really concrete answer to that. People have a lot of speculations. The map that I put up there showed that it kind of crossed the Canadian prairie, and people think that maybe there was historic fires and things in the prairie that really made it an inhospitable habitat before Western Europeans came along. And when we came along and just established homesteads that had a few trees around it, that provided the stepping stones for the barred owl to skip across the prairies that were previously so inhospitable to their migration. But that's somebody's guess. We don't really know exactly why.
You mentioned the 20,000 acres that were turned over to tribes. Do we have any indication of how those tribes, have they said anything about their management of those lands?
I am not aware of any concrete statements. In a previous tribal transfer, Congress required that the tribe conform to the Northwest Forest Plan, but they actually reversed that. And these tribal transfers, they didn't come with that stipulation. So the tribes are sovereign nations, and they can do what they want. In this proposal, they make it sound like the tribes will be, great partners and do innovative things to, protect the spotted owl. They have every right to manage their lands as they will, but I'm a little skeptical. Tribes don't have a great track record on managing valuable forests that could be turned into money, which is unfortunate. There's plenty of examples where tribes have, clear-cut beautiful habitat for a quick buck instead of conserving it, which is unfortunate. And I'm sure there's examples, where they've done the right thing many times too.
Jimmy, historic perspective on the Department of Interior, would you say that it's more incompetently managed than it was under Reagan and Watt now?
There's a lot of debate over that. I mean, David Bernhardt knows this agency very well, and he has been pulling all sorts of legal levers the whole time he's been there. On the other hand, and so they came in with the people who, Trump is one thing, but the people who actually took control of the Interior Department were longtime Interior Department observers from industries that have a vested interest in the agency, and so they came in knowing what they wanted and went about trying to get it. Now, on the other hand, they have had a lot of losses in the courts because they moved quick and they cut corners. And when they passed some of these rules and rolled back some of these regulations, they did it in a sort of slapdash way because they were trying to get so much done at once. And so they have lost a lot of things. For instance, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act rollback, just like last week or the week before, a judge in New York struck down the legal opinion that Daniel Giorgiani had written to basically gut that law. Now, who knows where these things will end up after they work their way through the entire court system, given the way that the courts have shifted under this administration. But there's definitely been plenty of sloppiness. They also got caught up in a ton of ethical scandals that they could have easily avoided if they just had followed the rules. And so there's a lot of the mistakes they've made at the same time as that they've been pretty relentless in their use of the agency to benefit their friends in the industry and otherwise.
Folks, go ahead and get your questions in. Doug, what other species would be impacted by these critical habitat rollbacks? The spotted owl is an indicator species. Will we see other species become imperiled by this?
Well, that's certainly possible. The Northwest Forest Plan basically really tried to make it not just a spotted owl plan, but an ecosystem management plan. And they found that there's 1,100 different species associated with old growth forests within the range of the spotted owl. Now, the range of this critical habitat reversal is smaller than the range of the owl, so there wouldn't be over 1,000 species, but there's really a lot of species associated with old growth forests, and these are some of the lower elevation, highly productive forests that really could have a lot of unique species. And it's possible that some will be pushed toward the edge, and there could be additional species listing someday because of it.
Jimmy, projecting forward in a worst case scenario, you've been watching the folks that have been lobbying the administration and where they've been coming from. If there was a re-election of President Trump, do you have any ideas of what the next steps for the Interior Department might be? What things we might see coming down the road?
That's a great question. I mean, the worst case scenario would be if their allies controlled the legislative branch as well, and were able to, there have been a lot of people, right-wing Republicans who have been trying to alter the language of the Endangered Species Act itself. And when they lost the House, that dream kind of died. But if they were to regain power there, that's the sort of thing that might happen that could be very devastating. The other thing I think that will do long-term damage is just the amount of career civil servants who have fled the agency because of the terrible conditions that they've been subjected to. I think I see that a lot as I mentioned, talking to Fish and Wildlife Service employees who have just retired because they couldn't take it anymore. And the move, a lot of people speculate that the move of the BLM headquarters to Grand Junction was an effort to basically purge the top ranks of the headquarters of institutional knowledge and longtime civil servants, so that they could pick their own people to replace them. And so if they are able to reshape the actual civil service, which they're definitely trying to do, I think they'll have, that will be a major project in a second term if they get a second term.
Yeah, it's almost like they're trying to erase the institutional memory of this agency by getting rid of so many long-term employees.
Absolutely.
Doug, is there a recent loss of critical habitat in the lands that will be crossed by the Jordan Cove LNG project? So are we seeing a little bit of a double whammy in some of those areas?
I haven't really looked for sure if this overlaps with the specific parcels that are affected by the pipeline, but there's definitely a double whammy in the sense that Southwest Oregon is is hardest hit by this proposal, and Southwest Oregon is where the pipeline goes through. So yeah, that's a good point.
And for Jimmy, how have salmon fared since the water diversion project? Do we have any data from that back yet? The California one that you referenced?
It's being litigated, and so no. But what I will say is that they're not doing well in general. I wrote an article for The Nation on that topic pretty recently. They're really struggling, and the thing about that particular water diversion project, it was just one of a suite of policy changes that the Bernhardt Interior Department is trying to push forward to benefit these same interests, including raising Shasta Dam, which would pull more water out of the river system, and actually handing over control of the irrigation infrastructure to these private interests, or these semi-private interests, I guess you could say. And so so they're working on multiple fronts to benefit Central Valley agriculture, which are a big Republican force in California, I should add.
Okay, and I think this one can actually apply to both of you. If the administration were to change, Jimmy, from something that is staunching the extinction crisis, what should be the #1 priority of the new administration? And Doug, what from the Oregon Wild perspective, what should be the #1 priority?
My perspective is that the most important thing that needs to be done is to revitalize the Fish and Wildlife Service. It has been in a downward spiral for many years throughout numerous administrations. The agency almost never calls jeopardy on development projects. It has a spotty track record designating critical habitats. It, is slow to list many species. And it's far too cozy with developers and others. And so I think what really needs to be done is for them to put, people say personnel is policy, and they need like a staunch endangered species advocate to be running that agency, and they need air cover from the White House. And they didn't get that under the Obama administration, and they're certainly not getting it now. And so I think the most important thing is to clean up that agency where a lot of the people at the top, even some of the career civil servants, are far too quick to do the expedient thing rather than to, fight for imperiled animals. And there's a lot of specific in the weeds policy things that could be done. But the most important thing is getting the right people in there and overhauling that agency's culture, in my opinion.
Well, to reverse this particular critical habitat issue, it's going to be a bit tricky because it's based on a legal settlement. But the legal settlement doesn't say they have to eliminate 200,000 acres. It just means they have to revise critical habitat. And so a different administration could make a very different decision about, what that looks like. But it would still have to comply with the legal settlement in itself. But in the big picture, the number one thing that a new administration would have to do is to, fully engage on climate change. And under that umbrella, there's so much that can be done with our public lands. The green carbon that comes from thriving ecosystems that store more carbon. And, we can protect our old growth forests and protect roadless areas and have more wilderness and wild and scenic rivers and, better run wildlife refuges and stricter endangered species rules are just, great things that could happen under that climate umbrella.
Okay, well, with that, I think we're actually going to end on time. Thank you, Jimmy and Doug. This was great. And thank everyone for attending. Next week, as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll be doing an extension of this conversation, talking more specifically about some of the environmental rollbacks that are happening here in Oregon and ways that people can participate in pushing back on those and making sure that we're building up some urgency for if there is a change in presidential administration, getting some of these things as a priority to reinstate environmental protections. So thank everyone for attending again, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.